Am I in or am I out? It is a basic human question raised in so many different ways and affecting most of us, at least, so powerfully. Myself, of course, went through the whole of my childhood knowing that as far as any team chosen for any sport, I was most definitely out and not in. And of course, it has remained so ever since throughout life. Father Jonathan and I hear every afternoon at the school gate the wailing of those children who've discovered that all their friends have been invited to the sleepover and the party, but not them. They too have found that they were out and not in. And perhaps of greater relevance to the Matins congregation at St Mary Abbots, as we take tea with our best and closest and dearest friends and neighbours, and surreptitiously just gaze perhaps on the invitations laid out on their mantelpiece, realise that once again, unlike them, we have been passed over for that little private dinner at Buckingham Palace. This feeling of not at all being in, but being out. It has, of course, infinitely more serious manifestations. The whole of the last couple of centuries of seeking to overcome racism and slavery is to realize that all human beings, all our sisters and brothers, are in and not out, not divided up on account of the colour of their skin and, of course, the extent to which women are all in as opposed to definitely out when it comes to positions of power, authority and responsibility is still a battle being waged and still much to be waged. And then, of course, there is that terrible experience of being out, which is the experience of exile, being driven from your home, your native land, being told with force that you no longer have a place there. This issue of whether we're in or whether we're out could be said to characterize both our Bible readings this morning. First, the Old Testament, that extraordinary story, that wonderful story, one of the great foundational stories of the Old Testament, of the books of the Old Testament, the appearance of God to Moses in the burning bush. Moses is out. Among all the children of Israel, he was the most in, because his mother refused to obey Pharaoh's injunction that all male children should be killed at birth. And instead, if you remember, put him in the ark, in the bulrushes where he's found by no less than Pharaoh's daughter, and she brings him up in the royal court of Egypt itself. But, when he reaches adult years, he sees an Israelite being utterly ill-treated and kills the man and rushes off into exile. And here we find him when this morning's story begins. He's worked for the priest of Midian as a shepherd for years and years and married his daughter. So he is really out from his own people, out from Egypt, that rich and wonderful land, out in the wilderness. But it is there, outside, where we might expect the revelation of God, that God actually comes to him through this remarkable phenomenon of a bush which is burning and blazing, but not consumed. Take off your shoes, the voice says, for you are approaching holy ground. And from this burning bush, the voice comes, the absolute promise of God, that he will save his people Israel from their slavery in Egypt and bring them out of Egypt in to their promised land. And of course, that is what happens. And then the story of Israel throughout the books of the Old Testament is very much a story about being either in or being out. The law, the great law, the whole temple ritual is there to enable people to have absolute confidence and assurance that they are indeed in with God. They keep the law, they maintain the rituals of the temple, then they are absolutely in, and they do not have to concern themselves about whether they have lost relationship with God. And the prophets, of course, the great and glorious Old Testament prophets, extend this concept and say this is not about something terribly exclusive, that they look for the day when the doors of the temple will be flung open, when the gates of Jerusalem will be open and all nations invited in to share in that absolute relationship with God and his salvation. And then we come to our second lesson, the letter to the Hebrews, an oddity among the books of the New Testament. It's not, despite what the Authorized Version says, and therefore which was properly said by our reader, not by St. Paul at all. It's an entirely different kind of text, a very different kind of Greek. So the Authorized Version, which of course we worship in this church, is nevertheless wrong. It's certainly not by St. Paul, but it's a jolly good piece of work. And it's written to the Hebrews. It's not a letter written to a particular Christian church here or there, in Philippi, in Corinth, in Ephesus, like the letters of St. Paul. It's written generally to Jews. And Jews who are considering whether they will become Christians, or perhaps rather more subtly than that, Jews who are indeed now Christians, but they're not quite sure whether that means that they stop being Jews as well. In other words, by following Jesus, have they now moved away from the rituals of the temple? On what does their salvation depend? On what does their relationship with the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob now depend? Does it depend on keeping the ritual law? Does it depend on fulfilling the daily sacrifice of the temple? Or has Jesus got rid of all of that? And so this great letter, this great piece of writing, is addressed to them. But it ends, and our reading was from the very final chapter, which is a wonderful chapter, chapter 13, the end of the letter to the Hebrews, has this really startling, it seems to me, really startling statement. Let me just remind you of it. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. The event which Jesus effects to set up the new relationship, the new covenant with God, is not performed in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, where one might expect the presence of God to be above anywhere else. It's not even within the holy city. It's actually in the place of degradation and reproach, outside the city. Not in, but out. And what the writer to the Hebrews says is this: let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp. Outside, that means outside the camp, outside the city, outside that place where God has set his holiness, that place where we are assured absolutely of the presence and righteousness of God, that place where we know we're safe, never mind everybody else, and instead go outside, to the place of reproach, of disgrace. For that is where Jesus dies, and that is where the love of God is now made manifest. I believe that this offers us a remarkable pattern of Christian living and Christian faith. So many of us spend most of our energy and attention into setting up a place which will be holy, a place where worship and ritual will be offered, the absolute guarantee of the presence of God. By most of us, of course, I mean me. That's what sermons are always about. Any good sermon is directed at the preacher and probably no one else at all. But we spend so much of our time and energy creating the space of holiness, and that's good. That's really valuable. Our world, our nation, our community desperately needs places that are holy and which speak of the peace and truth and presence of God, as I believe this temple does, that are open every day where they may come in. But perhaps, just perhaps, today's reading may enjoin us that we are encouraged not to stay here, but to go out. Moses encountered God on the mountainside, in the wilderness, in the place where God was least to be expected. Jesus manifests, shows forth absolutely the saving love and grace of God on the rubbish dump, the hill, the place of disgrace, right outside the holy city. So perhaps we as Christian women and men may strive with all our energy and our determination to be not in, but to be as out as possible. Amen. Amen.